Baby boomers.
I used to be with it.
Millennials.
Okay, boomer.
Generation X.
What's going on?
And Gen Z. What do they have in common? Not a lot, it turns out. But one thing they can agree on is that this is the political podcast they want to listen to. Welcome to Not My Generation, the political podcast that looks at political events, news, and happenings across the world and at home through a generational lens. Your hosts are Dr. Emily Stacy and Professor James Davenport, two political scientists from Rose State College. But the views expressed on this program are solely the views of the host and their guests and do not reflect the views of Rose State College, its administration, faculty, or students. Coming up on today's program.
I've got problems, Harvard.
The older I get, the more I tend to appreciate some of these moderates. Our financial situation is going down the tubes, but hey, we're pretty optimistic anyway. You know?
This was super, super interesting.
And now, here are James and Emily. Hello, Emily.
Hey.
How are you today?
Good. You'll be happy to note, we're still kind of in the middle of Christmas break, right?
Right.
And so 2 days ago, I've actually made it 1 year closer to 40, right? So I know you kind of like to...
Okay.
Right? I'm getting up there, dude. Right. We're getting there a little bit. Elder millennial, man. It's...
Every time you say something like that, I just feel older.
Right. I spent part of my birthday at the doctor's office. I'm really getting that adult feeling.
Now
these days.
I get that. Right. I have done that many a time. We're recording on December 29th.
Yes.
The last episode of 2023.
Indeed. We're not going to do a highlight reel, right? Because 2023 was pretty rough.
Maybe we should think about that at the end of next year. We could piece something together. That might be fun.
Yes, maybe next year. No, let's just let this one go.
Let this one. Yeah, 2023 has been an odd year. It really has on a whole range of ways, right? So, but I'm excited, looking forward to 2024. It's going to be very eventful. For some of us, it might be very depressing, depending on what occurs.
Right.
For some of us, it might be very productive, depending on professionally or whatever. Right. As we will get into the poll, I think people are really of two different minds about the state of the world or the state of the economy, these kind of things. I mean, it just seems like people are all over the place in how they answer certain questions. And maybe, as we were discussing before we came on, maybe that's due to some of the questions not being well written or very explanatory.
I've got problems, Harvard.
But it is the last program of the year. I'm excited. It's good to see you after this kind of break. It feels like it's been a long break. I know it hasn't been, but it feels like it has been. And I think there's just been a whole lot going on since we last were on.
Forever. Yeah.
We got a couple of polls we're going to be talking about. We have states weighing in on whether or not they're going to let former President Trump on the ballot this coming election. I'm just going to mention this very briefly, but Superintendent Walters did comply, apparently, with the subpoena.
Comply is a very generous word. I read that. It
sounds like a document dump is what it sounded like. They just provided a bunch of documents and said, here you go.
Yeah, the overlying summary report was, I think your children write longer book reports. So I think comply is, right. It's the very basic, right? The minimum, yes. The minimum.
So we will, I'm sure as they get into all of that and go through that, there may be some follow-up.
It'll be interesting,
But it was interesting that he at least avoided the controversy of not complying in some way. Right?
Yeah, no, he had to. He knows we're getting to February, man. February is coming, and those legislators Mark McBride is a Republican. It's a Republican supermajority. So this is not, some woke liberal mob coming for Ryan Walters.
Well, that depends on if you listen to Walters or you listen to other people, right?
McBride is
apparently anyone who disagrees with Walters is a woke liberal person who's trying to subvert good American wholesome and Oklahoma value. Who knows? But that was interesting. So what else do we got that you wanted? There was an interesting, you were talking about earlier, a PBS interview that was, you thought was pretty interesting as well. So where do we want to lead off?
Do you want to start with the ballot challenges?
Yes, let's do that. Let's do that.
So, go ahead. I mean,
so we've had 3 states now, kind of. 2, you had state Supreme Courts issue rulings. So you had the Colorado ruling. The court said, we think Trump was engaged in insurrection or whatnot, and so we've declared that he's ineligible to be on our ballot. The Michigan Supreme Court said, we're not even going to touch that, and basically left stand a lower court ruling saying he could be on their ballot. And then you said this morning that Maine's Secretary of State, so not a court, but the Secretary of State declared that Trump was ineligible to be on their ballot.
Yes.
So will he or won't he?
Well, the Colorado issue obviously was settled yesterday, so he can. In fact, at least for the it stands. He was never off the ballot, right? It was that was
they
right.
Stayed there. They stayed their
decision.
Ruling.
Yes, exactly. So that was resolved ish. But I think all of this boils down to the Supreme Court, right? They've got to rule.
They're going to have
sooner than later. But yeah, Maine being the latest. Maine itself, kind of a more purple turning state.
Sure, right.
They have a Democratic Secretary of State, and so you have a lot of folks on social media railing against this lady because she's part of that woke liberal mob, quote unquote. But I mean, you've got the Supreme Court has got to say something about this sooner rather than later. You're going to have these individual states doing this until June.
So here's my concern about the way some of this is being handled. And for those who have listened long enough, everyone should know I am not a Trump backer. Yeah. I'm not on the Trump train.
He is not.
But I have real concerns when, take the Colorado court ruling, for example. Basically, the court, without ever having a trial, without ever having any charges, specifically on the issue of insurrection, just summarily declares, we think you were engaged in insurrection, and so you're now not on the ballot. Yeah. And I got issues with that type of thing, because I certainly don't want the court, any court coming back, maybe a red state court comes in. You know what? We think Joe Biden probably did benefit from Hunter's activities. And so we're just not going to allow him to be eligible for I don't want that either, right? Interestingly enough, because I was looking at this when the Colorado ruling came out, there's been over 1,000 people charged with activities related to January 6th.
That was going to be my next
None of them, not one, has been charged with insurrection.
Okay.
Trump, in all of his legals, 90-some charges filed against him, not one has been on the issue of insurrection, right? I don't know how a court just decides we're going to declare him having done that without going through some due process, without having some kind of charges filed, case been, the opportunity to defend themselves. So,
well, you do have, right? He's indicted, right? At least one of the cases is regarding
but not for, there's a federal statute that defines insurrection and how it is applied. And in none of these charges has he been charged under that statute. And so, and maybe it's a case of, we're loosely defining insurrection, but that statute defines it pretty strictly and says, here's what it means. And he hasn't been charged with any of that. And that's my issue.
And so we're talking the 14th Amendment section.
So that's what Colorado said. He did this, right? But Congress passed a law that specifically says, here's insurrection. Here's how it's charged.
When was that passed?
This was passed, oh my gosh. It's been a while back, several decades.
Okay.
It may be longer than that.
I'm just trying to get a kind of a timeline.
And I should have looked it up. I looked it up at once, but
Because I want to
But
be.
he hasn't been charged
Sure.
under that statute.
I want to make clear, though, that the 14th Amendment, right, was adopted in, 1868?
1868, that's right.
And
It's
so,
not new.
again, right, you have some extremely vague language or right? And so it's good that Congress has redefined it. I'd be interested. We'll find that definition.
The 14th Amendment does give Congress the ability to enact operative statutes, right?
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. So that's my only issue. Listen.
It'll be interesting.
I have no qualms if and I certainly think Trump is guilty of a lot of stuff. I'm a little iffy on
rhetoric.
The rhetoric and insurrection. Was it an insurrection? Regardless, what happened on January 6th was an attempt to interfere with a legal federal government operation, right?
The
constitutional
transition of
That's
power.
exactly it was interfering with that. I don't think there's any question about that. I also don't think there's any question that Trump, at the very least, gave, as the statute and as the 14th Amendment, aid and comfort to the people engaged in that. I think that is clear too, right? But what I would like to see is a court take care of that with all the trappings of due process engaged. And then if states want to say, hey, he's guilty, he's not going to be, I'm all for that. I am A-okay with that. I just have this process of courts without a trial, without an opportunity for defendants to defend themselves, summarily just saying, yeah, you did it. And so that's my only issue. Not that I disagree with he did something illegal. Not that I disagree with it should disqualify him from serving in that office. I think process matters. In American government, we talk about that all the time. Process has to matter.
It has to matter. That's the only way you get to equity.
This is going to be interesting, and I think it's going to be interesting how the Supreme Court handles this too. I hope it's not a purely partisan divide.
I can't imagine.
And I'm going to tell you, this court has had a lot more unified rulings. I mean, not the bigger ones, not like the Dobbs or stuff, but in some of the cases regarding Trump, lots of unanimity, or at least very close to it on some of these things, right? So I'm hoping that the court finds a way. And Roberts really seems to be very, very intent on trying to minimize that partisan kind of divide where he can.
He is solely concerned with the legitimacy of his court.
Right.
Period.
And so I think he'll be working really hard to try to do that. And I hope he's successful. Whatever they come out with, I hope the court does not, people aren't going to say, if they're Democrats, oh, look, all those Republicans, or if they're Republicans, look at those Democrats or whatever, right? I think it's just.
I never thought I'd say thanks, George W. Bush, for John G. Roberts, man.
Right. And
thanks for the moderate conservative, sir.
I told you, the older I get, the more I tend to appreciate some of these moderates. You know, when I was a young conservative Republican, those rhino, not being a Republican anymore, that's a whole different thing. But I appreciate some moderates here and there, right?
This is a party that would eat Paul Ryan. They would eat.
I saw a clip of.
They just ate Kevin McCarthy.
A speech that President Reagan was giving over immigration and the importance of immigration, and I was like, he would never make it in a Republican primary at this point in time. Yeah, right.
Not today.
Just crazy.
Compassionate conservatism is long
That's long gone, right?
Yeah, very interesting. So yeah, we'll see going into 2024 what happens. But the Supreme Court's got to be.
And they've got to weigh in. And I think, as you said earlier, it's got to be sooner rather than later, right? They can't let this drag out.
It's going to be bad, right? You just let one state after the other, after the other, after.
And what you're going to have is you're going to have perhaps again more bluish states taking him off the ballot, red states having him on, and. We don't want an election happening that way.
How do you justify, legitimize? At that point, it's a bad situation.
Not good.
Indeed. So let's talk about the PBS poll really quickly before we get it. It sort of encapsulates and leads us to everything else. So PBS published an interview with the founder of a state news policy kind of organization akin to Non-Doc and OK Voice, et cetera. Just kind of judging state legislative sessions that are coming up in 2024 and what he believed would be the focus nationwide side. Tax cuts, right? So in the red states and the blue states, both, tax cuts will remain clearly a salient talking point, specifically related to property taxes. So a lot of you homeowners out there, right, my avocado toast millennial self does not at this point. But apparently, due to the rising housing cost, property taxes have also increased, and so you have a lot of governors and state legislators that are very keen to relieve some of that pressure down below on homeowners. So
okay, so
that'll be interesting.
Just
Yeah,
a little tangent here, not big.
Yay!
But
Is this Davenport's rant for the
I'm not
day?
going to rant. I promise.
Okay.
I just find it interesting that you have these two tensions working against each other. We want to keep property taxes low, but we're not going to do anything to allow more housing to be developed, which is going to drive property values up, which drives up property taxes, right? So at some point, some people got to pull their heads out of where and figure this out.
You're telling me the economy is cyclical?
I'm just saying that, and this is a matter of federalism, right? Because local governments primarily deal with zoning issues and where housing can be built, what kind of housing can be built, right? And they are at this point the bottleneck, those local governments on this issue. And somebody needs to figure out a way to put some pressure on them to say, we want more housing for people. We want affordable housing for people. Find a way to get it built, right? And as a property owner, it's not the government's responsibility to ensure that an asset that I have purchased increases in value. It's not its job, right? We would never say that about somebody who buys a stock and say, oh, it's the government's job to make sure that stock continuously goes up, right? But somehow we've said that with housing. And it's really distorted the way people think about housing, I think. And because of the lack of affordable housing, we have a lot of people, a lot of younger folks who would like to have their own home who just can't.
Me.
Right? And that's not fair. It's not right. And we need to do something about it. But that's just a tangent. Sorry, I didn't mean to go too far down the rabbit hole, but we got to figure that out.
No, I totally agree, because I chose a PhD and now I'm having to try to figure out how those loans, how we can get a house.
A house,
of that, right?
And it's
hard.
a very challenging issue. That's exactly right.
It's difficult. Workforce development, workforce retention and development. This is across the board the name of the game. And we've been hearing it in Oklahoma for the last 3, 4, 5 years, at least, the focus on workforce, and I think it will continue to be a major one here.
So can you tell me, what do we mean by workforce development?
So developing specifically the skills of the retiring boomer generation. So as we talk about on this podcast, you have Gen X, my generation, the millennials, and Gen Z coming in to fill these jobs that don't have the knowledge, right, in some of these very old or antiquated industries and some of this industrial work. And so we're having a really difficult time replacing these folks. And then you also have states, right? Back in the day, back in your day, back in the 1980s or so, you were seeing, states compete for larger businesses, right? Big corporations to come in. Now they are competing for workforce, right? Specific workforces, right? It reminds me of the billboard. We were coming back from the Beyonce concert in Missouri, and at the kind of state line, you saw a teacher recruitment sign. Like, hey, we paid this much, come to Missouri. I was, taken aback by that, right? And we're seeing it all the time. And so that workforce development is an important thing, but retention, states being able to hold on to these, skilled workers is very difficult.
Challenging thing for all states right now. Is to, and certainly a state like Oklahoma, we have a small population to begin with. Right. We have a relatively poor population compared to a lot of other places in the country, especially some of our nearby neighbors. And so when people graduate college or they go through career tech or something, and they're looking for opportunities, a lot of times they look out of state because they see more opportunities there, right? And so how do we as a state
or better paying
try to create,
opportunities?
right? And how do we keep those folks here? And there's no easy solution.
No, absolutely. As we've seen with the teacher shortage, I mean, there is absolutely no easy solution, right? Emergency certifications, trying to, roll people through and get degrees
and even
quicker,
even on we talk about, well, we need to increase teacher salary. Well, guess what? Every other state's doing that too. And if they're already ahead of us,
exactly,
we could increase it by $10,000 a year. And we still might not catch up because they're that far ahead of us to begin with. And so it's extremely challenging for any policymaker to say, here's how we can solve this problem.
To catch up when you're so far behind, unfortunately. And so they just broke it down, blue states versus red states, which I thought was interesting. So blue states are more likely, or state legislators are more likely to focus on housing and homelessness. In blue states, rent stabilization. So, of course, going back to the property tax, avoiding rent and an eviction crisis. Which, of course, we kind of mitigated during the pandemic, right, with different subsidies and things like that, incentivizing landlords not to evict. But those things are largely going away or have gone away at this point. Gun safety as well, and limiting assault weapons is going to be a big one in blue states. And then red states, again, tax cuts, teacher retention, workforce retention and development, and then licensure. That's a very difficult word to say. Licensure reform for some professional
occupational licensing.
Exactly.
Right?
Yeah. Yes. Right. Which totally feeds into the workforce development crisis, right? If you are unskilled, you want to have, development plans and education programs, training programs in place, and to make it available and accessible to folks to get the proper licensing to cut hair or, whatever the need may be. But you also don't want to make it so difficult that people just say no to begin with.
The issue with occupational licensing and a whole range of occupations is that in many ways it protects the haves from the have-nots, right? Because you make it either they're so expensive to go through that unless you already have the resources to do that, you don't have the opportunity to obtain that, or the time frame in which you have to take to do it is too long for some folks. Some states are offering, I just saw this in, was it Washington State or Oregon? They are giving attorneys a way of getting their license without taking the bar exam. And so it's almost like an apprenticeship.
Okay.
And so it is so many hours of apprenticeship with a practicing attorney, and then they can earn their license that way, which I thought was interesting. And so, and you're seeing that with other occupations that you don't think of, but like you said, with hairstylists, hair salon owners, and such. Other occupations, I think we could really take a really good look at. Are these licensing requirements necessary? Are they simply protection for current owners and people who have the licenses? And how do we get that? Because I think that's a huge issue for, again, those who want to be entrepreneurial, those who want to have a skill, those who want to do this, but don't have the resources. And we shouldn't be putting up barriers to those folks, right?
Totally agree.
Yeah, so I think that's a good one to watch as well.
Excellent. So you want to move on to Harvard?
Oh, Harvard, our favorite place.
Yeah, man. This one it's an interesting encapsulation of what's going on in America. I think, as you alluded to earlier, we seem to be very scattered, and specifically by age group, which is perfect again for this podcast.
And this poll did have some really good stuff breakdown. So did the if we get to it, the New York Times poll had some good stuff based upon age as well. So
we'll get to it, I promise. Yeah. So in terms of the Harvard-Harris poll, so this one was put out when? Early December, roughly?
Yes, December 13th and 14th. Okay. Did I say that right? Yeah. Yes, December 13th and 14th.
Perfect. So a little bit, just a bit before the New York Times poll. So I just kind of wanted to be on the right track comparing those numbers. Really interesting. So 59% relating to the conversation we just had about the economy say that the economy is on the wrong track versus 33% who say the right track. Only 44% noting the economy is strong today. Again, we've said it over over and over, it doesn't bode well for Biden going into 2024.
No, it does not. And, not surprisingly, there's a divide between Republicans, Democrats, and independents. But for me, the problem for Biden is that only 27% of independents said that the country was on the right track economically, right? That the economy was going in the right direction. And so that's who
everybody's got to watch.
Those folks are gonna, I think, make the difference in this election, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And you don't want to be upside down with those voters.
No, you're upside down with everybody. 49%. I loved this one. 49% say their personal finances are getting worse. Even so, 47% still are optimistic about life in the next year.
Yeah, I was like, what's going on?
Bowled over.
Do they not make the connection? Are they looking at different things? I guess I could say, look, financially, and let me just take myself personally, right? So we've got some expenses coming up this year that's going to make our financial position a little bit more challenging than it has been in prior years. But on the whole, I could say, everything else is going, the family's doing well. The kids are moving in the right direction. We've got good jobs. So maybe there's kind of that going on with some of these folks. I don't know, but there does seem to be this kind of disconnect that our financial situation is going down the tubes. Right. But hey, we're pretty optimistic anyway.
We're good. Yeah. I was bowled over by those two numbers. 49% saying their finances getting worse, right? That's your dinner table. That's your pocketbook. I just don't know how Biden can overcome that, especially when folks, overwhelmingly said that their finances were better under the Trump administration.
What I found was interesting is you couple that with the question about the recession. Do you think? So 38% think we're in a recession now, and 35% think we're going to go into a recession, right? So 73% think we're either in or headed towards a recession.
Hey, we had a panel on this, people. We're not in a recession.
We're not in a recession. The economy is actually very strong right now. Unemployment is low. Inflation is going in the right direction, at least the rate of growth. And I think this is what the disconnect is with voters on the issue of inflation, right? So you had inflation spike, right, up over 8% for a year. While the rate of inflation has declined, it still went up. So if you look at the last 2 years, prices 11%, right, over where they were pre that time, right? So I think voters are still reeling from that, and they're not seeing the relief come as fast as they would like to see it. Yeah,
absolutely. So just the approval rating I thought was also interesting, right? Just the comparison. So Biden's approval rating at its highest was 62%, and this was in June of 2021. And I will note that this is like weeks before, right? The withdrawal from Afghanistan began, and that tanked Biden's approval rating. So it was at its lowest at 38% in February, in June and July of 2022, except for, right, according to the New York Times poll, which we just mentioned, I believe it was published on the 17th of December, has him sitting at 37% right now. So not super numbers.
That's not where you want to be a year out from election day.
At all.
Yeah.
And what are you going to do to improve that?
I hate to be this way, but Biden's best hope is that Trump gets the Republican nomination.
Good Lord, have the numbers in your tariff? No,
I know.
I don't know if it is, though.
I say that, and then if you look at some of these approval ratings for Trump, and you're like,
and the matchup numbers are,
oh my goodness, yeah, right. So
I don't think that's, no, I don't think so.
Well, I don't know if you want to jump to that or not, but if you look at a couple of questions that I thought were interesting relating to Biden, do you find him mentally fit to serve, right? 62% felt like mentally he is not fit. And then is he too old, right? So I guess this is more like a physical kind of, and 64% felt he's too old, right? Those are not great numbers.
They're not at all.
I don't know. I don't know what he does to turn those around.
Yeah, I have no idea. There was another one that I thought was interesting. So 56% of voters would consider an independent moderate candidate if it ends up being Trump versus Biden. So is third party viability back? And then 63% believe the country needs another choice beyond Trump versus Biden. There was another one that I wanted to find that they specifically noted that folks believe that a vote for Biden is effectively a vote for Harris because he won't make it through the second term.
I saw that one too.
That one I thought was just, oh my goodness. Well, this is not good.
And if you look at, so here's a question, right? They said, do you view Trump as a threat to democracy, right? Yeah. 51% said, yes, we view him. But then you look at the Trump-Biden matchup number, and he's up 47 to 42%.
Yeah. That's wild. It's wild.
And I think it's the New York Times poll, they asked a question about, do you think he's guilty of things?
Yeah.
56%. Large percentage
56%, yes, believe that he is.
But you know what? We don't care. Yeah. We're going to vote
anyway. Yeah, right?
And I'm like, oh, what are you people thinking?
Yeah, this was super, super interesting. In terms of, before we move on to Gaza, I thought, good Lord, this is terrifying. So 47% of folks approve of the Democratic Party overall, which is terrifying, right? Just another sign of that identity crisis I continue to talk about in terms of the Democratic Party. And the second choice for Biden, right, if he weren't to run in 2024, was Kamala Harris, but at like 20%, which, as I've been saying repeatedly, she's not viable across the board in the Democratic Party. This I thought was really scary. RFK Jr., right? Robert F. Kennedy Jr. At 49%. Elon Musk at 49%. Benjamin Netanyahu, at 36%, and Nikki Haley at 41% are the most favorable political figures in the United States.
It was Haley, RFK Jr., and who was the other one? There were three of them that had actually the highest net positive, right? And so I find that, of course, Haley may have undone that this week with her
perhaps
flubbing of what is it about Republican? Why should I see this way too often among Republican candidates for office? You get hit with it. This should have been no hard question.
You know the answer to this.
Question. This was an easy answer.
The answer is they're terrified of the MAGA crowd, right? That was not the right answer though there is no right answer in 2024. Right. My affirmation for 2024 is to simply get through the election cycle, right? That is it.
Survive it, right?
Just get through it. But yeah, she's terrified of that base that they know that they still at least have to have not railing against them.
I'm sorry.
That was an internal rant.
Oh my gosh. Yes. I don't get it. This was not a hard question to answer.
It really wasn't. No.
Listen, of all the Republican candidates out there, I still think Haley's
best. She's it.
She's best. And I think the polling shows she would be the best for Republicans. She'd be the best matchup against Biden.
Yes. Right? Oh, I agree.
But come on, at some point you got to just take a stand and say, look, of course, Chris Christie's been doing that and he's polling at 3%. So, maybe you're right. Maybe there's a trade-off here and it's just about surviving.
It is. Yeah, it's got to be just about survival. So you want to get into, was there anything else generally?
Yeah, no, before we get into the Israel-Gaza stuff, just interesting. So they asked a question about support for Ukraine in the Harris poll and support for Israel. Both of them had the exact same number. 65% said we want to support Ukraine and 65% said we wanted to support Israel, right?
Interestingly, yes. But another 65% think that holding up funding for either of these two countries, Israel or Ukraine, until the southern border is funded.
The border issue, right?
is okay.
Of course, and then they basically Congress said we're not
going to do that. It was 72%. I'm sorry, I just found that stat. 72% believe a vote for Biden is a vote for Harris. 72%. That's wild. The Israel Ukraine number is very, very interesting. Go ahead.
I was just going to say back on that the Biden Harris thing. So what does that do for him? Is that a drag on it because she's underwater, even with Democrats, so to speak? So. Is that a drag on his?
Oh, absolutely. It's a boogeyman for Trump, the Republicans. Absolutely. Yeah. Totally.
I'm afraid for a good portion of them, you're exactly right.
Yeah, it's a boogeyman.
And I hate saying that, but I think I don't think there's any way. Listen, we live in a state, when President Obama came here, you had people lining up the roadways where he was traveling with Confederate flags.
Were we part of the Confederacy, Professor Davenport?
We were not, but we were split. So I mean, because Oklahoma wasn't a state.
There you go.
Right?
There
Oklahoma wasn't a state. Right. But the Native American tribes, you had some that were supportive of the Union and some that were supportive of the Confederacy. But as a state, we didn't exist. So in my imaginary world of there, I can always hold out hope that we wouldn't be. But the fact that I have so many people who think it's appropriate to greet the first African-American president who comes to your state to promote something going on in your state, and you greet them with a Confederate flag. I'm sorry.
The commutation of...
I think you are exactly right in that there's a large portion of those voters that a black woman as president is the boogeyman for them. Yes, I said that.
Yeah. So,
all right, now we can get on to the Israel-Gaza stuff, which is all over the map.
Where do you want to start with this? Because it's really interesting.
Yeah. So, a couple of things that there seemed to be pretty strong unanimity on. Almost everybody, so 84% said that they agreed that the attack on October 7th was a terrorist attack. Right. 73% said that the attack was genocidal in nature, right? So, and all age groups were pretty much well above 60% on those questions, right? So what I found interesting, though, is if you go to that, do you think that the attack can be justified because of how the treatment of the Palestinians, right? Yeah. I didn't like that question, can be justified. I would much rather see stronger. Do you think the attack is justified? To me, that's a little bit clearer of a message, right? Because I can theoretically say, well, I can see how I might not agree with them, but I can see how they might justify it, right? And so I'm wondering if these numbers aren't picking up that kind of thinking.
Yeah, it does seem to be pointed. Some of these questions seem to be very pointed. You're missing alternatives that would probably be the majority of folks in some of these questions. I don't know.
But if you look at that, so again, 73% said they didn't think it could be justified, right? But you see a very significant age difference in the response to this, right? Yeah. With 60% of 18 to 24-year-olds saying, yes, it could be, right? No other age group agreed that it could be. And the older the group, the less they say that, right? And so what is going on with that age group that has them so out of step with the older age group? And even the next cohort, right? So the stronger millennial, right? We're not in line with that younger generation on that, right?
Absolutely. As some of it is a lack of history, right? Lack of knowledge. But interestingly enough, and I think I've mentioned it briefly before, you've got a digital war front that's also going on, right? Both Israel and the not Hamas, but Palestinians, generally speaking, are waging a war on the things like TikTok, specifically is what we've been hearing through different news stories that TikTok has been pushing. The algorithm has been pushing largely pro-Palestinian, which is, let me again clarify that Palestine and Palestinians are not Hamas, right? Because I think that there is a false equivalency here.
Yes. Although I keep getting conflicting messages as to the extent to which Hamas does or does not have support from Palestinians. It seems they have stronger support in Gaza than in the West Bank.
Sure. Well,
I'm
yeah,
not sure
right.
that's correct, but
No, it is because the Palestinian Authority,
Right.
the PLA, is largely is in charge. I'm sorry, in the West Bank,
Right.
while Hamas took power in Gaza. But that was a generation ago, right? I need to reiterate as a comparative theorist that this generation of Palestinians did not elect Hamas.
Right.
There's not been another election held.
And in fact, Hamas has not permitted any other elections to occur, right? And you have to say, okay, we have Hamas from the Gaza, those who live in Gaza, the Palestinians. We have Hamas and we have Israel. Who do we blame more for our situation? Sure. And I think they are looking at them both saying they both suck.
Yeah, absolutely. Right. You're getting a backlash amongst Israeli citizens against Netanyahu and the response right now.
I think deservedly so.
That's an interesting segue. But generally speaking, just to answer your first question, I think that it is a large mis and disinformation campaign and a lack of knowledge, right? Historical context for specifically the younger, right? The Gen Z. And you've seen, riots break out in high schools, right? There was one that I was talking to my students at OCCC about a couple of weeks ago, just before Christmas, where this teacher had posted that she stood with Israel and she was at a pro-Israel demonstration. And that got all over her social media and the kids picked it up and it was a huge riot effectively. And the teacher had to be hidden in a closet. I mean, this was, and this is going on across the country. And so, and again, these are kids in, Queensboro, New York. How much context, right? Historical context do you have? And I ask that of all Americans, right? This is an issue that is extremely nuanced and it is much deeper than I think a lot of Americans want to realize. This is not just a religious conflict.
No,
this is a political conflict. This is a sovereignty, self-determination, autonomy, international community's recognition type of conflict, right? And so again, it just kind of, that's Dr. Stacy's rant of the day. It gets conflated in the United States. It goes to
the point. I mean, we've seen this for a long time, for as long as I can remember. Americans aren't that familiar with things outside our borders.
No, but we like our friends and we know who our friends are.
Right. And I think the fact that you have these two things going on, you have Israel as a nation state surrounded historically by others that don't like them. Right. They're the only democratic system within that area. They have historically been a U.S. ally. But their treatment of the Palestinians is not the kind of treatment that we would historically say that's a good thing. Right. And so you have these two tensions going on. But when it comes into this kind of conflict, any of that nuance seems to just evaporate, and you're either for one side or you're for the other.
And I think some of these questions, like the two-state solution question, I think that's why they hit me so viscerally, because it's not black and white, right? You see, this conflict is extremely muddy. The Biden numbers here, I think, are great. So approval of the handling of the war between Israel and Hamas, Biden's approval stands at 42%. And I would imagine it would continue to go down. And particularly, as you noted, only 33% in the New York Times poll approve of Biden's handling of Gaza. And that goes way down. Under age 30, approval is at 26%, just generally overall, and then 20% on Gaza specifically. 19% because he believed that he is too supportive of Israel. And so you do really have this shifting tide, right? While overwhelmingly Americans polled in both polls do say that Israel was hit by a terrorist attack and should be able to defend itself, the manner in which, right, and to the extent, I think that Netanyahu's military is going to right now is starting to wane American support, specifically the millennial and under crowd.
Yes, and in that question about too supportive of Israel, again, you see this age break, right?
Yes.
And now the New York Times poll uses different age brackets, but 18 to 29 were the ones who most likely, still over a majority said that they didn't think he was too supportive, but 45% said he was too supportive, right? Much higher than the other three age brackets. The other thing I thought was the size of the split on the question of who do you think would do a better job, Trump or Biden, right? Yeah. Trump getting 46% and Biden 38%, right? That is because now you're seeing voters think, I think there was somewhere in one of these, voters think Trump would do a better job on the economy, and they think he'd do a better job on foreign affairs.
Which to me tells me maybe a little bit about these.
Maybe these
voters.
Voters are forgetting the 4 years of Trump. I don't know. Maybe I don't know if they're like, look, we just don't like the way things are going. So whoever is, I don't know what's going on here.
I think specifically on this issue, overwhelmingly Americans support Israel blindly, and they saw Trump move the embassy to Jerusalem. They saw the moves that Trump made and knows how close, at least until recently, he has kept Netanyahu, right? The rhetoric on Netanyahu for Trump has only changed recently.
Right. That's what Trump came out and said, he was praising Hamas, at least they were so smart in how they attacked Israel. And it's like, and Israel just fumbled the ball. And yet all of these folks who want to support Israel are saying, yeah, we think Trump would do a better job. Right. There's some disconnect going on here that I don't get. It's what made a lot of these, the results of these questions almost more confusing than they were enlightening.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. 48% to 30% believe that Israel is not taking enough care to avoid civilians in Gaza. And as you mentioned, right, 46 to 38%, Trump is trusted more to handle Gaza. It's interesting, because, of course, the United States has now, rejected a resolution calling for a ceasefire on civilian casualties. So those Biden approval numbers saying that, we're unhappy with your response because you're too supportive of Israel, and yet, we're making these very public declarations, like in the United Nations, that we're not going to support a ceasefire. It's counterintuitive, I think. I've seen a lot of posts on social media from younger Palestinian Americans, Arab Americans, just regular Americans, right? Who are very upset, right? I've seen them holding signs that say, "Don't make me vote for Trump." I'm lost for words on this situation in the United States specifically, and our response.
So I want to go back to the Harris poll for a second, because they touch on some things. If you remember, we had Dr. Brett Sharp and Dr. Shannon Padgham on back in November before the OPSA meeting, right? And I was going to ask a question, and I decided to hold off because I wasn't ready to ask that in public. Okay. But this poll touches on that issue, which is rising anti-Semitism and anti-Semitism specifically on college campuses, right? Sure. And so in just the general, the public said both that they think that anti-Semitism is growing in the country. At 75% said yes. They also said that 65% of them also said, we also think discrimination against Muslims is growing as well, right? And I can see that. I can see both of those, right? Absolutely. 68% said that they believed that there was growing anti-Semitism on college campuses. And another 76% said that there was an increase in Jewish harassment on college campuses, right? This is the Harvard poll. And so whether or not, and let's stipulate this, the environments can be different at different college campuses and different types of colleges. So if you look at our college, Rose State College, I don't think you see this kind of stuff going on, but our student population is much different.
Yes, absolutely.
And we have students that are focused not just on trying to get through college, but taking care of their families, working a full-time job, all of these other concerns. And they're not as immersed in some of this as students who are at some elite universities. They don't have to worry about supporting their families.
We also have a probably negligible population of Jewish students on campus. I would be surprised.
I would be surprised if we did, right? I don't know. And that's probably true across the state, although probably OU and OSU might have a higher population than, say, the regional universities, which are going to have a higher population than maybe, say, community colleges, right? So yes, I think you're exactly right on that. So let's make sure people understand different colleges can have different kinds of environments and different kinds of things, dynamics playing out over these kinds of issues, right? But the perception that there's this, whether or not that perception is real, and we don't have to go there right now, but whether or not that perception is real, to me, doesn't matter as much as if the public thinks there's a problem there,
it's palpable,
and you're going to those people saying, we want your money, you got a problem. Absolutely. You have a real problem, right? And then, of course, they asked a whole bunch of questions about the 3 university presidents that went before Congress. That was a debacle from all angles. They did not perform well. They got hit from the left and the right on their performance. And this poll kind of bears that out. Most people didn't think that they condemned anti-Semitism enough on their campuses. You had 62% who said that they didn't. There was a break in age groups on this, right? So under 45, you had more support saying, yeah, they addressed it, but narrowly for the 2 older ones in that category. So 25 to 34 and 35 to 44, both around 50%, 55%. 18 to 24-year-olds, though, 67% said they did it. You go to the above 45, 45, 54, 62% said no. 73% of 55 to 40-year-olds said no. 65 plus, 81% said no, right? So there's this huge divide on this perception of what they should have done. Now, I'm probably going to get into all sorts of hot water with some folks on this other question. So they asked this question, and I don't like 2-part questions. Because I think, but they said, should hate speech regarding Jews be viewed as free speech, or should there be consequences for that, right? And again, there's this age divide. 53% of 18 to 24-year-olds said it should be considered free speech. All other age brackets, increasingly by age, said that they should face consequences, right? I'm probably going to side with the youngsters more on this. First of all, there's no agreed upon definition of what constitutes hate speech.
Agree.
That's a term that I feel like oftentimes from both sides gets thrown around when they don't like something somebody else says. And listen, there's all sorts of offensive speech. I can agree with it. I see people on Twitter all the time that say things and I just like, that is so egregious. That's offensive. But the First Amendment protects that, right? Now, private universities can have more strict speech codes. I don't think they necessarily should, but they can. But public universities are bound by the First Amendment, and should honor that. I think where these college presidents got into trouble was the perception that all of a sudden they were for free speech, when in past instances they had clamped down on speech that they hadn't, speech, right? And I think that's what got them in hot water, that's fair. Right? So their performance, and we've already seen one of those college presidents, the president of, I think it was MIT, is that right? No. It was the University of Penn. University of Pennsylvania. She resigned. The president of Harvard, the board, their official governing board, has backed her, but she's still under severe criticism. I'm not sure about the president of MIT. So,
the Harvard president is having, I've got feelings about that one, but I'm going to let it go. I just wonder, my friend, what if the question is reversed? Right? What if the question is, is it okay for Israeli settlers to, encroach upon land that was decided in an international treaty. You know what I mean? If the question had been turned around, and if it had been turned around in that congressional hearing and in this poll, what would that look like?
I think you're right. And that goes to some of this how you ask questions really matters. What questions you ask matters. They ask a question: does calling for genocide of Jews constitute hate speech? Obviously, vast majority of people said yes. Almost 80% said yes. But again, constitutionally, hate speech is protected speech, right? And I think there's also this question of, as we have learned with social media, well, you may utter protected speech that is protected from government retribution. That doesn't mean you won't suffer consequences.
Right. There's the court of public opinion that exists out there.
And I think we've seen some of that play out over this issue, right? And so I think that question of consequences, where should those consequences come from? Should the government punish them, right? So, yes.
It is.
There were some questions there. There's a question about identity politics dominating universities. Again, a large 64% believe that identity politics does dominate at universities. There was a question that was basically a critical race theory question that wasn't named critical race theory. Basically, are white people oppressors? Again, 65% said no, we don't agree with that. Although, again, there was a divide in that younger cohort, 18 to 24, 79% said yes, right? They were the only age group that said yes, although the next age group, that 25 to 34, 51% opposed, so it was narrow. Right. Above that, it's over 60% for the rest. Again, as you go older age bracket, the older you oppose that. So I thought that was interesting as well, that you have this, again, this divide between those younger cohorts. Now, I saw a guy who was writing up criticizing this poll, and saying that if you look at other polls, it wasn't consistent with these other polls. All right. The one poll that I remember him comparing this to, though, remember, this is a poll of registered voters. The poll he was comparing it to was just the general population, right? Yeah. We know there's a difference between those two. Absolutely. And so that was the one criticism I had of his look at this was, you're not exactly comparing apples to apples here. And we know that when you're looking at voters, you're looking at usually a higher educated, higher income, and older voter, right? And so even when you're looking at that younger cohort, they're going to tend to come from wealthier families. And more educated families, right? And so,
which is why I think that explains a lot of the responses in this Harvard poll.
I think it
skews conservative for me.
Well, yes and no, right? So not with that younger cohort.
Not with the younger cohort.
Not with that younger cohort.
No, but the questions,
but with some of these others.
I don't. This two-state solution question really plagues me. So
talk about that for a second. Let's dig into that.
Listeners, this is the question: do you think that the long-term answer to the Israeli-Palestinian dispute is for Arab states to absorb Palestine or Palestinians, for there to be two states, Israel and Palestine, or for Israel to be ended and given to Hamas and Palestine? So already I agree with Professor Davenport's assessment that, my God, what a compound question. Right. But the one response that is not given, that I think overwhelmingly given, again, the response and the demographics, as you just pointed out, of these registered voters, which would be Israel to absorb Gaza and the West Bank, that's not even an option. Right. Yes. It's problematic. And of course, 60% overwhelmingly support a two-state solution on Israel and Palestine, which, again, is very interesting. Again, the age demographics, 18 to 24. This is the Harvard Harris poll. 51% of 18 to 24-year-olds believe that Israel should be ended. But no other, of course, age cohort believes that. The rest of them, starting at 49% for 25 to 34-year-olds, so the millennial generation, believe that the two-state solution would be the best option. This is right. I think that's about as likely as a ceasefire coming in Ukraine.
Well, there are all sorts of complications with that. And everybody might have a different idea of what that means, right? This is my problem. When you're asking people about questions about subjects for which you know their knowledge is you need to provide a baseline of information to make sure everybody's on the same page as to what we're talking about. Then you ask the question, right? Yes, that makes the question take a little bit longer, but it ensures that you've got some baseline level of information
viable.
We're running out of time.
Oh dear. As usual.
The lovely Peaches reminded me that we're brushing up. So real quickly, we touched on this earlier. This Times Siena poll. Overall, Trump 46, Biden 44%. Favorability, Biden at 39%, Trump at 43%. Or Biden approval was that's favorability. And again, head to head, Trump 46, 44. You go to this question, do you think Trump's guilty of these crimes? 47% said yes. Yep. And they're going to vote for him anyway.
Yeah, sure. They're just going to roll the dice.
I guess.
He might not get through a second term either.
So the bottom line is these polls are all over the place. Yeah. Some of the question wording is not great. And so you got to be careful about how you interpret this. Yes, absolutely. I think, and I really do want to explore this question of anti-Semitism on campuses, identity politics. These are for other episodes later on down the road. But they lead to some interesting questions. And they help explain some of the divide over higher education today. But we need to get out of here. Yes, sir. I want to wish you a happy New Year. I hope you have a great one.
Me too.
Wish our listeners, we thank them.
Yeah,
thank you to Possibilities Inc. for making this podcast way more attractive to listen to than it had been before.
Absolutely.
And we love our partners here at Possibilities Inc. Thank you to Lauren for being our producer, who we affectionately refer to as Peaches. Yeah. And wish everybody a happy new year. We will see you in 2024.
Yay. We love communication that goes both ways, not just you listening to us pontificate. We would love to hear from our audience. If you have comments, suggestions, or would like to contact us about possibly being a guest on the show, please email notmygeneration@raider.rose.edu.